Hello there, it's Michael Angel with Fix a Tune, and I'm excited we're moving on to number 4 out of 5 on 5 types of EQs. So we've covered the program EQ, we've covered the mix EQ, we've talked about mastering EQ, so now we're going to talk about the console EQ. So I'm excited, this should be really fun. So we can look at the basic function of a console EQ, but it's also kind of fun to look at the history of EQs and consoles. First of all, console EQs usually are found in line in a single channel all across a recording console, a mixing console, a mixing desk, whatever you want to call it, those big boards with all the faders on them. If you go back through history, going from the 50s into the 60s, by the early 70s we had pretty much what you think of as the traditional analog mixing console, and it wasn't really until the 80s, and I would say pretty far into the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, that price started coming down for some what we would say prosumer mixing consoles, something that was affordable to a project studio. The buy-in really for a project studio was still, $40,000, $50,000 to get a decent console, to get a decent tape machine, to have a couple of good compressors and a couple of good EQs. But the purpose of the console EQ is to really deal with that channel as you're mixing or recording. If you are a studio in the traditional sense, you probably have built up your outboard gear, in your 60s and 70s studios. But the console is the center of the mixing room. It's where all the junctions come together. Your microphones are basically patched permanently into your mixing console unless you override that with a patch bay for an outboard mic preamp. You may want to spend time EQing each item that is being recorded as it's going in so that it is catching the overall sound that you want to tape. Typically, console EQs are mono. In the same way that you're dealing with one mic preamp, you're dealing with one input with that same signal path in mono going to its one track on tape. And then if you're inline, you're switching from going to tape to monitoring off of tape. You are free to use that EQ once again. You get a different effect in EQing what's coming off of tape because you may be intentionally saturating the sound. You may be introducing noise. There's a lot of different things that factor into what the producer chooses to do. But the purpose of the console EQ is to be able to hone in on something and notch it out if it's sounding really bad, to enhance something so that you might be able to capture a little more of an element that would typically get lost going to tape. There are a lot of producers that for a long time would slam levels very hard to tape and intentionally increase the shelving EQ in the high end so that as it saturated, it captured a simulated brightness that would remain there all the way into the final mixing and mastering stages. So as you lost a generation to a second generation to maybe even a third before your duplication tracks, that high end was giving the effect that there was still plenty of high end there. Each console EQ typically is on every channel, so if you have an 8 or 16, 24, 32 in a matrix, you have a console EQ on every one of those channels, sometimes on the bus groups as well, and sometimes on the masters as well. But certainly, the purpose of the console EQ is if you had to, you could get an entire mix done without needing extra preamps and without needing extra EQs. The really good consoles, the SSLs, the APIs, the Neves, these are all things that we still use the same designs today. And in fact, a lot of times we compare anything new that comes out to, is it as good as one of those? When you build something that sounds great to the ear, until science starts messing with our ears to give us something different or better or supposedly better, things that sound great are always going to sound great. So in the usefulness of the EQ, the console EQ might need to do a high pass to get rid of hum, or a producer might choose to always hit certain instruments or voices without any of the extreme low frequencies. Same thing goes for they might do a low pass where they may notch out things from the high end to always make room for them. Some people might take all of the drum set except for the cymbals and notch out some of the highs, and might do a low pass on all the highs at a very high filter So you have different EQs that some people like their consoles for what the EQ choices are. But certainly as we've gone along today's studio, you can have all these things inside the computer and you're using them, do I feel like an SSL or an API or a Neve today? And what a wonderful luxury. In fact, for less than the cost of a channel, you could have all three and they sound extremely close to the originals. Also of distinction, a single channel of a console EQ, really good stuff, is usually $600 to $1,000 or so. But then you add in the extra electronics with the mic preamp, the line input. You might have a single channel strip that is useful for a project studio that's $1,100, or it might be up to $3,000 or $4,000. These days, you're really only paying $3,000 to $5,000 for the original name, or for something very boutique quality or esoteric. Most designs center around a classic tube design with passive and with amplification and push-pull, or your op-amp with and without transformer based around the original Jensen 990 design. These things are not incredibly expensive to build, but they sound fantastic and they last a really long time. With the EQs, we're usually talking inductor-based EQs. And of course, the quality range on that differs. But console EQs are also very specific to the brand and specific boards that we remember through history for having a certain sound because of the shape choices of the filters that are built in, how much flexibility that there is, and what they're specifically made to deal with. Enhancing certain frequencies on vocals, enhancing certain things on cymbals, being able to capture sound going to tape. So I would say that in anybody's set of mixing tools, I highly recommend having at least one or two very realistic sounding console EQs, usually in channel strip form, but if you have the independent EQ on its own, you can match it to something that's similar to the preamp or the rest of their electronics, so that you can simulate the feel of putting together the pieces of an analog studio that you think sound the best. And once again, you might run into the same problems that I do with mastering EQs, which is I love them all. Which one am I going to use? Because whichever one I don't use, I wish I still had that too. So if you have one really good API, one really good Neve, one really good SSL, everything else is pretty much, each person is going to find their favorites. You might love the sound of a Quad 8. Most engineers that have heard them or worked with them would agree that a Trident original series followed closely by an ADB, meaning the A range or the B range, are some of the best musical sounding console EQs ever made. And certainly the list goes on, but there's your console EQ, usually mono, usually inline, meant for recording to tape and tracking coming back off of tape. And today we use it as part of a massive color palette because we have so much available to us. So we have truly the best of not both worlds, but all worlds. We can use whichever studio we really want at any given time for only a couple $100 per item. So fantastic. All right, that's it for our console EQs. And moving on to the fifth of this series of 5 videos, I'll be talking about outboard equalizers. So join me for that video too. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you haven't already, please go to fixatune.com, click on forum, and come register, join us, be a part of our community online. I'm looking to build our community. I need your help to get the word out. It's completely free, and whether you're a beginner, intermediate, pro, we're all there to help each other, giving everybody an opportunity to crack whatever it is that they may be stuck on, deal with a particularly difficult mix, or to just learn all the basic skills that we all need in order to be better producers and engineers. So please come and join. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless you.